The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Thornfield Manor as Duke Alexander Ashford paced nervously in his private study. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on his shoulders, and the constant worry about his daughter Charlotte's safety had begun to consume his every waking moment. At 42, Alexander had faced many challenges as the head of one of England's most prominent noble families, but nothing had prepared him for the terror that now gripped his heart. Charlotte, his precious 8-year-old daughter, had been the target of what appeared to be a series of increasingly dangerous incidents over the past month. What had initially seemed like accidents now formed a pattern that chilled Alexander to the bone. The first incident occurred during a family picnic when Charlotte's sandwich contained small metal shavings. The second happened at her riding lesson when her saddle strap had been deliberately weakened. Each time, they had been fortunate that Charlotte escaped serious harm, but Alexander knew their luck wouldn't hold forever. The Duke's wife, Duchess Eleanor, had initially dismissed his concerns as paranoia brought on by the stress of managing the family's vast estates and political responsibilities. However, after the third incident involving a loose chandelier in Charlotte's bedroom that crashed down moments after she had left the room, Eleanor too became convinced that someone was deliberately targeting their daughter. James Morrison, the head of security at Thornfield Manor, was a former military officer who had served the Ashford family faithfully for over 15 years. His weathered face and sharp eyes reflected years of experience in protecting high-profile families from various threats. When Alexander first approached him with his suspicions, James immediately implemented additional security measures around the manor and began conducting discreet investigations into the household staff. The manor itself was a sprawling estate that housed not only the immediate family, but also dozens of staff members, from kitchen workers and gardeners to personal assistants and tutors. Each person had access to different areas of the house, and James knew that identifying the threat from within would be like finding a needle in a haystack. Nevertheless, he was determined to protect Charlotte at all costs. On this particular morning, as Alexander continued his worried pacing, James knocked on the study door with an urgency that immediately caught the Duke's attention. The security chief's usually composed demeanor showed cracks of concern that Alexander had rarely seen before. "Your Grace, we need to talk immediately," James said, his voice low and serious as he entered the study and carefully closed the door behind him. "I've discovered something that confirms your worst fears about the threats against Lady Charlotte." Alexander stopped pacing and turned to face James, his heart racing as he prepared to hear what new horror had been uncovered. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed to dim as James reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small evidence bag containing what appeared to be tiny, glittering fragments. "I found this while conducting my routine inspection of the kitchen areas this morning," James explained, holding up the bag so Alexander could see its contents clearly. "These are crushed glass fragments, and they were deliberately mixed into Lady Charlotte's breakfast porridge before it was to be served to her." The color drained from Alexander's face as the implications of James's discovery hit him with full force. Someone within their own household, someone they trusted with their daily lives, had attempted to seriously harm his innocent daughter. The thought that Charlotte could have unknowingly consumed those glass fragments made Alexander feel physically ill. "How did you discover this?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he struggled to maintain his composure. "And more importantly, do we have any idea who might be responsible for this latest attempt?" James set the evidence bag on Alexander's desk and pulled out a small notebook filled with his observations from recent weeks. "I've been conducting random food inspections as part of the increased security protocols, Your Grace. This morning, something about the texture of Lady Charlotte's porridge seemed off to me. When I examined it more closely under a magnifying glass, I discovered these fragments mixed throughout the serving." The security chief flipped through several pages of his notebook before continuing. "I've been tracking the movements and activities of all staff members who have access to the kitchen areas. Based on my observations, I've narrowed down the list of suspects to 3 individuals who had the opportunity to tamper with Lady Charlotte's food this morning." Alexander moved to his desk and slumped into his leather chair, the weight of the situation threatening to overwhelm him. The idea that someone in their employ, someone who had likely smiled at Charlotte, and perhaps even played with her, was systematically trying to harm her, was almost incomprehensible. "We need to handle this carefully, James," Alexander said, rubbing his temples as he tried to think clearly despite his emotional turmoil. If we move too quickly or make accusations without solid proof, the real culprit might flee before we can identify them. At the same time, we cannot allow Charlotte to remain in danger for even one more day." James nodded in agreement, his own anger at the situation carefully controlled but clearly visible in his clenched jaw. "I recommend we implement immediate changes to Lady Charlotte's routine while we conduct a thorough investigation. No food should reach her without being personally prepared and tested by someone we absolutely trust. I also suggest we install hidden cameras in key areas to catch the perpetrator in the act." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's laughter echoing from the garden outside. Through the window, Alexander could see Charlotte playing with her younger brother Timothy under the watchful eye of their nanny, completely unaware of the danger that surrounded her. Her innocent joy in such a simple moment broke Alexander's heart and strengthened his resolve to protect her. "I want you to quietly interview each of the 3 suspects," Alexander instructed James. "Don't let them know they're under suspicion, but try to gauge their reactions when you mention Charlotte's well-being. Sometimes guilt or malicious intent can reveal itself in subtle ways." As James prepared to leave the study to begin his covert investigation, Alexander stopped him with one final instruction. "And James, I want you to know that I'm prepared to offer a substantial reward for information leading to the identification of whoever is behind these attacks." Sometimes financial incentive can loosen tongues and reveal secrets that might otherwise remain hidden. The 2 men shook hands with a solemnity that reflected the gravity of the situation. As James left to begin his investigation, Alexander remained at his window, watching his daughter play and wondering how someone could possibly want to harm such an innocent child. The glass fragments in the evidence bag seemed to catch the morning light, creating tiny rainbow reflections that served as a beautiful but sinister reminder of how close they had come to tragedy. Little did Alexander know that the discovery of the crushed glass was only the beginning of a conspiracy that ran much deeper than he could have imagined, involving secrets from his own past that he had long thought buried forever. 3 hours after his disturbing conversation with James, Duke Alexander found himself unable to concentrate on any of his usual responsibilities. The estate's financial reports lay untouched on his desk while his mind raced through possible motives for the attacks on Charlotte. As he sat in his study reviewing the list of household staff in his mind, a soft knock on the door interrupted his troubled thoughts. Eleanor, his wife of 12 years, entered the room carrying a tea service and wearing an expression of barely controlled anxiety. Her usually perfectly arranged auburn hair showed signs of distress, and her typically immaculate appearance revealed the toll that recent events had taken on her peace of mind. Despite her own fears, she had been trying to maintain normalcy for the children, while supporting Alexander through this crisis. "The children are having their afternoon lessons with Miss Peterson," Eleanor said as she set down the tea service and took a seat across from her husband. "Charlotte seems completely unaware of what happened this morning, thank goodness. But Alexander, we need to discuss what James discovered and what our next steps should be." Alexander poured tea for both of them, his hands slightly trembling as he recounted the details of James's discovery. Eleanor listened in horrified silence, her face growing paler with each detail about the crushed glass that had been intended for their daughter's consumption. "Have you considered that this might not be random?" Eleanor asked quietly, her voice barely audible as she voiced the fear that had been growing in her mind. "What if someone is targeting Charlotte specifically because of who she is, because of our family's position or wealth?" The question hung in the air between them like a dark cloud. Alexander had indeed considered this possibility, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel more real and more terrifying. Their family's prominence in society, combined with Alexander's involvement in various political and business ventures, had certainly created enemies over the years. "I've been thinking about that constantly," Alexander admitted, setting down his teacup with a clink that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet study. "There are several business deals that have created tension, and my recent support for certain political reforms has definitely angered some powerful people. But to target an innocent child because of disagreements with me seems almost unthinkably cruel." Eleanor reached across the desk and took her husband's hand, providing what comfort she could while struggling with her own fears. "We need to consider temporarily sending Charlotte away to stay with your sister Margaret in Scotland until we can resolve this situation. I know you don't want to be separated from her, but her safety has to be our primary concern." Before Alexander could respond to Eleanor's suggestion, Another knock on the study door interrupted their conversation. James entered with a grim expression that immediately told them his investigation had uncovered additional troubling information. "Your Grace, your ladyship," James said with a formal bow before getting straight to the point. "I've completed my interviews with the 3 staff members who had access to the kitchen this morning, and I've discovered some very disturbing information that suggests this conspiracy runs deeper than we initially thought." Alexander and Eleanor exchanged worried glances as James pulled out his notebook and began sharing his findings. "The first person I interviewed was Mrs. Sarah Collins, the head cook who has been with the family for 8 years. Her reaction to my questions seemed genuine, and her alibi for this morning is solid. She was working directly with the kitchen staff and would have noticed if someone tampered with Lady Charlotte's food." James flipped to another page in his notebook before continuing. "The second person was Thomas Harper, one of the newer kitchen assistants who was hired about 6 months ago. His responses to my questions were nervous, but I believe his anxiety came from general concern about the investigation rather than guilt. His work history and references check out completely." Eleanor leaned forward in her chair, sensing that the most important information was yet to come. "And the third person?" she asked, though she dreaded hearing the answer. "The third person is where things become very concerning," James said, his expression growing even more serious. "Miss Victoria Blackwood, Lady Charlotte's personal tutor, who was hired 18 months ago, had access to the kitchen areas this morning and had the opportunity to tamper with the food. But more importantly, when I mentioned the recent incidents involving Lady Charlotte, her reaction was unusual." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that Victoria Blackwood had been spending hours alone with Charlotte every day for the past year and a half. The young woman had seemed perfectly qualified when they hired her, with excellent references and impressive educational credentials. Charlotte had actually grown quite fond of her tutor, which made the possibility of Victoria's involvement even more devastating. "What kind of reaction did she have?" Alexander asked, dreading the answer but knowing he needed to hear every detail. James consulted his notes again before responding. "When I mentioned that we were concerned about Lady Charlotte's safety due to recent accidents, Miss Blackwood's first question was whether we suspected anyone specific. Most people would have asked what kind of accidents or expressed concern for Lady Charlotte's well-being. Instead, she seemed primarily interested in whether we had identified any suspects." Eleanor gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand as the implications became clear. "You think she was trying to find out if we suspected her specifically?" "That's exactly what I think," James confirmed grimly. "Additionally, when I mentioned that we were reviewing everyone who had contact with Lady Charlotte, Miss Blackwood became visibly agitated and began making excuses about why she might need to leave her position earlier than planned. She claimed her mother in Ireland had become seriously ill and might need her care." Alexander stood up abruptly and began pacing again, his mind racing through all the times Victoria had been alone with Charlotte, all the opportunities she had had to harm his daughter. The betrayal felt personal and devastating, especially considering how much Charlotte trusted and liked her tutor. "We need to investigate her background more thoroughly," Alexander declared, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I want you to contact the employment agency that recommended her and verify every single detail of her application and references. If she's been living a lie this entire time, there might be clues about her real motives." James nodded in agreement but held up a hand to indicate he had more information to share. "I've already begun that process, Your Grace, and I've discovered some preliminary information that's very troubling. The address she listed as her previous residence in London appears to be false. When I contacted the employment agency, they said their records show a different address entirely." Eleanor stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the garden where Charlotte and Timothy were still playing under the watchful eye of their nanny. "If Victoria is behind these attacks, she's had countless opportunities to harm Charlotte during their daily lessons. Why hasn't she acted more directly before now?"
"That's an excellent question," James replied thoughtfully.
"It's possible that she's been building up to something more serious, testing our security measures and our reactions to see how much she could get away with. The escalating nature of the incident suggests someone who is becoming more confident and more desperate." Alexander rejoined the conversation with a new sense of determination. "I want Victoria watched constantly from this moment forward, but she cannot know that she's under suspicion. If she realizes we're on to her, she might either flee or attempt something even more dangerous as a final desperate act. The three adults spent the next hour developing a careful plan to monitor Victoria's activities while protecting Charlotte from any further attempts on her life. They agreed that Charlotte's routine would be subtly modified to limit Victoria's unsupervised access, while James worked to uncover the truth about her identity and motives. As evening approached and the children were called in for dinner, Alexander watched Victoria closely during the meal. Her behavior seemed normal on the surface, but now that he knew what to look for, he noticed subtle signs of tension in her posture and forced quality to her smiles when interacting with Charlotte. The most chilling moment came when Victoria offered to help Charlotte cut her meat during dinner. Alexander quickly intervened, claiming he wanted to spend more time with his daughter, but the incident left him shaken. How many times had Victoria had similar opportunities? How close had they come to losing Charlotte because they had trusted the wrong person? That night, as Alexander tucked Charlotte into bed, she mentioned casually that Miss Blackwood had seemed different lately, more distracted and sometimes impatient during their lessons. Children, Alexander realized, often noticed things that adults missed. Charlotte's innocent observation provided additional confirmation that Victoria Blackwood was not who she claimed to be, and that the danger to his family was far from over. The following morning brought with it a storm that matched the dark mood settling over Thornfield Manor. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the estate, while thunder rumbled ominously in the distance, creating an atmosphere that seemed to reflect the growing tension within the household. Alexander had slept poorly, haunted by nightmares of what could have happened if James hadn't discovered the glass fragments in time. James arrived at Alexander's study earlier than usual, carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing an expression that suggested his investigation had uncovered information even more disturbing than they had initially feared. The security chief had spent most of the night conducting research into Victoria Blackwood's background, and what he had discovered painted a picture of deception that ran far deeper than a simple case of mistaken identity. "Your Grace, I need to share what I've learned about Miss Blackwood. But I must warn you that the information is quite shocking," James said as he spread several documents across Alexander's desk. "The woman we know as Victoria Blackwood is not who she claims to be, and her presence in our household appears to be part of a carefully orchestrated plan that has been months in the making." Alexander studied the documents with growing alarm, his hands trembling slightly as he read through false credentials, forged references, and evidence of a web of lies that had allowed a dangerous imposter to gain access to his family. The real Victoria Blackwood, according to James's research, was a genuine tutor who had died in a carriage accident nearly 2 years ago. Someone had stolen her identity and used it to infiltrate the Ashford household. "The employment agency that recommended her has been cooperating with my investigation," James continued, pointing to a series of correspondence that revealed the depth of the deception. "They received all of her documentation through the mail, never actually meeting her in person before providing their recommendation. The references she provided were all fabricated, using the names of real people who had no knowledge of any Victoria Blackwood." The implications of this revelation struck Alexander like a physical blow. This wasn't a case of a troubled employee acting out of desperation or temporary madness. Someone had invested significant time, effort, and planning into placing a dangerous individual in close proximity to Charlotte, with the specific intent of causing her harm. "Do we have any idea who this woman really is?" Alexander asked, his voice barely concealing his rage at the thought that someone had been plotting against his innocent daughter for so long. "And more importantly, do we know who might be behind this conspiracy?" James pulled out another set of documents, these containing photographs and information that he had managed to obtain through his contacts in law enforcement. "I believe I've identified her true identity, Your Grace. And if I'm correct, this situation is even more personal than we initially thought." The photograph James placed on the desk showed a woman who bore a strong resemblance to the Victoria Blackwood they knew, but with different hair color and clothing style. According to the accompanying documents, her real name was Catherine Mills, and she had a history of criminal activity including fraud, identity theft, and assault charges that had been dropped due to lack of evidence. "Catherine Mills," Alexander read aloud, studying the photograph intently. "I don't recognize this name or face. Why would someone I don't know want to harm Charlotte? What could possibly motivate such an elaborate and dangerous scheme?" James hesitated before presenting the final piece of information, clearly understanding that what he was about to reveal would be deeply painful for Alexander to hear. Your Grace, I believe the motivation for these attacks may be connected to events from your past, specifically related to business dealings that took place about 5 years ago. Alexander looked up sharply from the documents, a feeling of dread growing in his stomach as he realized that James had uncovered something that connected these attacks to his own actions. What business dealings? I've been involved in dozens of different ventures over the years. Which one could possibly justify targeting an innocent child? Do you remember the construction project for the new hospital wing that you opposed 5 years ago? James asked carefully. The project that would have been built on land that you owned, but which you refused to sell because you believed the proposed hospital was unnecessary and would primarily benefit a group of investors rather than the community. Alexander's face went pale as the memory came flooding back to him. 5 years earlier, he had indeed been approached by a group of investors who wanted to purchase a large tract of land he owned on the outskirts of town. They claimed they wanted to build a new hospital wing that would serve the growing population. But Alexander's investigation had revealed that their real intention was to build a private medical facility that would cater to wealthy patients while providing minimal benefit to the local community. I remember that situation clearly, Alexander said slowly, his mind beginning to connect the dots between his past decision and the current attacks on Charlotte. I refused to sell the land because I believed the project was essentially a scheme to enrich the investors while claiming to provide a public service. Several people lost significant amounts of money when the project fell through because they couldn't secure the land. James nodded gravely as he pulled out the final document from his folder. Catherine Mills was the daughter of Robert Mills, one of the primary investors in that failed hospital project. According to my research, Robert Mills lost his life savings and his family's home when the project collapsed. He suffered a heart attack 6 months later, which his family blamed on the stress and financial ruin caused by the failed investment. The connection hit Alexander like a thunderbolt. Catherine Mills wasn't just a random criminal who had somehow targeted his family. She was seeking revenge for what she perceived as his role in her father's financial ruin and subsequent death. In her twisted mind, Alexander's business decision had destroyed her family, and now she was attempting to destroy his by harming his most precious possession, his daughter. She blames me for her father's death, Alexander whispered, the full horror of the situation becoming clear to him. In her mind, I'm responsible for destroying her family, so she's trying to destroy mine by targeting Charlotte. James confirmed Alexander's understanding with a somber nod. That appears to be her motivation, Your Grace. She's been planning this revenge for years, carefully studying your family, and waiting for the right opportunity to gain access to your household. Becoming Charlotte's tutor gave her the perfect position to carry out her plan. The storm outside seemed to intensify as Alexander processed this information, rain beating against the windows with increasing violence while thunder crashed overhead. Eleanor entered the study just as James finished explaining Catherine's motives, and Alexander quickly brought her up to speed on the shocking discoveries. So this woman has been living in our home, teaching our daughter, and planning to harm her for over a year? Eleanor asked, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and outrage. How could someone carry such hatred in their heart for so long while pretending to care about Charlotte? James gathered the documents back into his folder as he prepared to outline his plan for confronting Catherine Mills and ending the threat to Charlotte once and for all. The evidence we've gathered is substantial enough to have her arrested, but we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed. If she realizes that we've discovered her true identity, she might attempt to harm Lady Charlotte immediately as a final act of revenge. Alexander stood up and moved to the window, watching the storm rage outside while his mind raced through their options. The knowledge that someone had been plotting against his family for years was almost overwhelming, but he knew that he needed to focus on protecting Charlotte and bringing this nightmare to an end. What do you recommend as our next step? Alexander asked, turning back to face James and Eleanor. We need to remove this threat from our home and ensure that Charlotte is safe. But we also need to make sure that Catherine Mills faces justice for what she's attempted to do. James outlined a careful plan that would involve coordinating with local law enforcement to arrest Catherine Mills while she was away from Charlotte, minimizing the risk of any final desperate attempt to harm the child. The plan would require precise timing and coordination, but it offered the best chance of ending the threat while ensuring Catherine faced the full consequences of her actions. As they finalized the details of their plan, none of them noticed the figure listening outside the study door. or realize that their careful plotting was about to be turned against them in ways they never could have imagined. Catherine Mills stood frozen in the hallway outside Alexander's study, her heart pounding as she absorbed every word of the conversation taking place behind the partially open door. After 18 months of careful planning and patient execution, her carefully constructed false identity was crumbling around her. The family she had infiltrated to destroy now knew exactly who she was and why she was there. The irony of the situation was not lost on Catherine. She had spent years fantasizing about this moment when Alexander Ashford would finally understand the pain he had caused her family. She had imagined confronting him directly, forcing him to acknowledge his role in her father's death, before taking away the thing he loved most. Instead, she found herself discovered and cornered, her plans unraveling faster than she could adapt. As she listened to James Morrison outline his plan for her arrest, Catherine's initial shock gave way to a cold fury that had been building for years. These people had no idea what real loss felt like, she thought bitterly. Alexander Ashford had destroyed her family's future with a simple business decision, treating their desperation as nothing more than an inconvenience to his privileged lifestyle. Catherine quietly slipped away from the study door and made her way to Charlotte's playroom, where she knew the 8-year-old would be spending her morning, while the adults discussed her fate. The child was sitting on the carpet, completely absorbed in arranging her collection of porcelain dolls for an elaborate tea party, humming softly to herself as she worked. "Good morning, Charlotte," Catherine said, forcing her voice to maintain the warm, caring tone that had helped her gain the child's trust over the past year. "Would you like to have a special lesson today? I thought we might take a walk in the gardens, despite the rain." Charlotte looked up with bright, trusting eyes that made Catherine feel a momentary pang of something that might have been regret. The child had done nothing wrong, but she was the key to making Alexander Ashford suffer, the way Catherine's family had suffered. Sometimes innocent people paid the price for the sins of their parents, Catherine reminded herself, pushing down any doubts about her chosen course of action. "Will we get very wet in the rain, Miss Blackwood?" Charlotte asked, already beginning to pack away her dolls with the obedient trust that Catherine had carefully cultivated. "Mama doesn't usually like me to go outside when it's storming like this." Catherine moved closer to Charlotte, kneeling down to help her with the dolls while keeping her voice casual and friendly. "We'll bring an umbrella, and I know a special place where we can stay dry while still enjoying the fresh air. It will be our little secret adventure just between us." The mention of a secret adventure made Charlotte's eyes light up with excitement. Children loved secrets and special privileges, and Catherine had learned how to use that natural enthusiasm to her advantage. Over the past 18 months, she had gradually built a relationship with Charlotte that allowed her to occasionally bend the usual rules without causing suspicion. As Charlotte gathered her coat and rain boots, Catherine's mind raced through her options. The original plan had been to continue the gradual escalation of accidents until one finally succeeded, but that luxury of time was no longer available to her. James Morrison's investigation had been more thorough than she had anticipated, and now she needed to act quickly before they could arrest her. The walk through the garden took them away from the main house and toward an old stone structure that had once served as a groundskeeper's cottage, but had been abandoned for several years. Catherine had discovered this building during her early explorations of the estate, and had secretly prepared it as a backup location for exactly this type of emergency situation. "Where are we going, Miss Blackwood?" Charlotte asked as they approached the cottage, her voice showing the first hint of uncertainty as she realized they were moving further from the house than usual. "This place looks scary, and Mama told me never to go in old buildings by myself." Catherine placed a reassuring hand on Charlotte's shoulder, maintaining her calm demeanor while internally calculating how much time she had before the family realized they were missing. "Don't worry, Charlotte. I explored this cottage earlier, and it's perfectly safe. We're going to wait here until the storm passes, and then I have a very special surprise to show you." The cottage's interior was dark and musty, with dust-covered furniture and cobwebs in the corners that made Charlotte cling closer to Catherine's side. The windows were small and dirty, allowing only dim light to filter through, but Catherine had previously stocked the building with supplies that she now hoped she wouldn't need to use. As they settled into the cottage's main room, Catherine found herself studying Charlotte's innocent face and wondering if she truly had the resolve to go through with her plan. The child represented everything that Catherine had lost when her own family was destroyed: security, love, and a bright future filled with possibilities. Taking that away from Alexander would be the perfect revenge, but actually harming an innocent child was proving more difficult than Catherine had anticipated. "Miss Blackwood, I think I'd like to go back to the house now," Charlotte said, moving toward the cottage door with a determination that caught Catherine off guard. "The storm is getting worse, and I want to see Mama and Papa." Catherine quickly moved to block Charlotte's path to the door, her friendly facade beginning to slip as the stress of the situation mounted. "I'm sorry, Charlotte, but we need to stay here for a while longer. Your father and I have some important business to discuss, and you're going to help me make sure he listens carefully to what I have to say." The change in Catherine's tone and demeanor immediately frightened Charlotte, who began backing away from her tutor with growing alarm. The 8-year-old didn't fully understand what was happening, but her instincts told her that Miss Blackwood was no longer the kind, caring teacher she had known for the past year. Meanwhile, back at the manor house, Eleanor had gone to check on Charlotte and discovered that both the child and Victoria were nowhere to be found. A quick search of Charlotte's usual play areas revealed no sign of either of them, and none of the other staff members had seen them leave the house. "Alexander!" Eleanor called frantically as she rushed back to the study where her husband and James were still discussing their plans. "Charlotte is gone, and so is Victoria. I've searched the entire house, and no one has seen them since this morning." The blood drained from Alexander's face as he realized that their careful planning had come too late. Catherine Mills had somehow discovered that they were onto her and had taken Charlotte somewhere unknown. The very scenario they had been trying to prevent was now unfolding, and his daughter was in the hands of a woman who blamed him for destroying her life. James immediately sprang into action, organizing a search of the estate grounds while contacting local law enforcement for assistance. The storm that had been raging all morning would make the search more difficult, but every minute that passed was a minute that Charlotte remained in danger. "We should have acted immediately when we first suspected her," Alexander said, his voice filled with anguish and self-recrimination. "I was so focused on gathering evidence and planning the perfect arrest that I forgot the most important thing was getting Charlotte away from that woman." Eleanor took her husband's hand, providing what comfort she could while struggling with her own fears about their daughter's fate.
"We'll find her, Alexander."
"We have to find her. Catherine Mills might hate you, but she's not a killer. She's a woman who's been consumed by grief and anger, and maybe we can still reason with her." As the search parties spread out across the estate, none of them knew that in a forgotten cottage less than a mile away, Catherine Mills was struggling with her own internal battle between revenge and conscience, while Charlotte Ashford sat in frightened silence, wondering why her trusted teacher had suddenly become someone she didn't recognize. The storm reached its full fury as search parties combed through every inch of the Thornfield Manor estate, their voices calling Charlotte's name barely audible above the howling wind and driving rain. Alexander led one of the search teams himself, refusing to remain safely in the house while his daughter was missing, despite James's concerns about his safety. Every moment that passed without finding Charlotte felt like an eternity, and the desperate father found himself bargaining with forces beyond his control, promising anything if only his daughter could be returned safely. In the abandoned cottage, Catherine Mills paced nervously while Charlotte sat huddled in a corner, her small frame trembling from both cold and fear. The reality of what she was doing had begun to sink in for Catherine, and the weight of holding an innocent child against her will was proving far heavier than she had anticipated. The rage that had sustained her for years was now mixed with doubt, and the growing realization that her quest for revenge had transformed her into the very type of person she had once despised. "Why are you doing this, Miss Blackwood?" Charlotte asked in a small voice, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Did I do something wrong in my lessons? I promise I'll study harder if you take me back to Mama and Papa." The innocent question struck Catherine like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the reality that Charlotte had never been anything but kind, eager to learn, and trusting. The child had often brought her small gifts, wildflowers from the garden, drawings from her art lessons, and once even a handmade bookmark with Catherine's name carefully spelled out in Charlotte's careful penmanship. "You didn't do anything wrong, Charlotte," Catherine said softly, kneeling down to Charlotte's level while struggling to maintain control of her emotions. "This isn't about you at all. It's about your father and things that happened before you were born, things that you couldn't possibly understand." Charlotte wiped tears from her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to be brave despite her fear. "Papa is good," she said with the fierce loyalty that only a child can possess. "He reads to me every night, and helps me with my pony when I'm scared. If he did something that made you sad, maybe you could just talk to him about it instead of hiding here in this scary place." The child's simple wisdom and unwavering faith in her father cut through Catherine's carefully constructed justifications like a knife. For the first time in years, Catherine found herself questioning whether her father's financial ruin had truly been Alexander's fault, or whether she had been so consumed by grief that she had needed someone to blame for the tragedy that had befallen her family. Outside the cottage, the sound of voices calling Charlotte's name grew closer as the search parties methodically covered the estate grounds. Catherine knew that discovery was inevitable, but she found herself paralyzed by indecision. Her original plan had been to force Alexander to experience the same loss she had suffered, but now that the moment had arrived, she realized that harming Charlotte would not bring her father back or heal the wounds that had been festering for years. "Miss Blackwood," Charlotte said quietly, standing up and moving closer to Catherine with a courage that belied her young age. "I think you're very sad about something, and when I'm sad, talking to Mama or Papa always makes me feel better. Maybe if we go back to the house, they can help you feel better too." The child's genuine concern for her welfare, even in this frightening situation, completely shattered the last of Catherine's resolve. She found herself crying for the first time since her father's death, all the grief and anger and loneliness of the past few years pouring out in great, wrenching sobs that seemed to echo through the cottage. Charlotte, despite her fear, instinctively moved to comfort her troubled tutor, placing a small hand on Catherine's arm in a gesture of compassion that demonstrated the kind of character that came from being raised in a loving, nurturing environment. "It's okay to cry," Charlotte said softly. "Papa says that sometimes crying helps wash away the hurt feelings." The sound of footsteps approaching the cottage interrupted this moment of emotional breakthrough. Through the dirty windows, Catherine could see the shapes of searchers moving through the storm, and she knew that her time had run out. The choice she made in the next few minutes would determine not only Charlotte's fate, but also whether she would be remembered as a woman driven mad by grief or as someone who had found the strength to choose compassion over revenge.
"Charlotte," Catherine said, wiping her tears and looking directly into the child's trusting eyes.
"I want you to know that none of this was your fault, and I'm sorry that I scared you. Your parents love you very much, and they must be terrified right now not knowing where you are." Catherine moved to the cottage door and opened it, calling out to the search parties in a voice that carried clearly through the storm. "She's here. Charlotte is here, and she's safe." The relief in her voice was genuine as she realized that she was choosing to end this nightmare rather than perpetuate it. James Morrison was the first to reach the cottage, his hand on his weapon as he prepared to protect Charlotte from whatever threat he might encounter. What he found instead was Catherine Mills standing in the doorway with her hands raised in surrender, while Charlotte ran past her and threw herself into James's arms with a sob of relief. "Thank God you're all right," James whispered, holding Charlotte tightly while keeping a careful eye on Catherine. Within minutes, the cottage was surrounded by searchers, and Alexander and Eleanor arrived to embrace their daughter with tears of joy and relief streaming down their faces. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" Eleanor asked, checking Charlotte over carefully, while Alexander held them both in a protective embrace. "Did she hurt you in any way?" Charlotte shook her head, still clinging to her parents, but looking back at Catherine with something that might have been sympathy. "She was crying, Mama. I think she's very sad about something that happened to her papa." As the authorities led Catherine away in handcuffs, she found herself looking back at the family she had plotted to destroy. Instead of the satisfaction she had expected to feel, she experienced only emptiness and the belated recognition that revenge had never been the answer to her pain. Alexander watched her go with a mixture of relief and something that might have been pity, understanding now that Catherine had been as much a victim of circumstances as his own family had been. In the days that followed, as the family recovered from their ordeal and Charlotte gradually returned to her normal routine, Alexander found himself reflecting on the events that had brought them to this point. His business decision years earlier had indeed contributed to Robert Mills's financial ruin, though it had been made with good intentions and careful consideration of what would best serve the community. Catherine Mills was sentenced to several years in prison for kidnapping, attempted assault, and fraud, but Alexander made sure she received counseling and support during her incarceration. He also established a scholarship fund, in memory of Robert Mills, dedicated to helping families who faced financial hardship due to failed business ventures. Charlotte, with the resilience of childhood, gradually overcame the trauma of her experience, though she never forgot the lesson she had learned about the importance of compassion, even for those who had caused harm. The cottage where she had been held was demolished and replaced with a memorial garden dedicated to healing and forgiveness. The glass fragments that had started this entire ordeal were kept as evidence during Catherine's trial, but afterward Alexander had them melted down and formed into a small sculpture that he placed in his study. It served as a daily reminder that even the sharpest edges of hatred could be transformed into something beautiful when touched by understanding and mercy. Years later, when Charlotte had grown into a young woman, she would often speak about the importance of addressing pain and loss through healing rather than revenge. The frightening experience with her tutor had taught her that hurt people often hurt others, and that sometimes the greatest strength lies in choosing to break that cycle through forgiveness and compassion. The Ashford family never forgot how close they had come to losing everything, but they also never forgot that even in their darkest moment, love and courage had been stronger than hatred and revenge. The storm that had raged during Charlotte's disappearance eventually passed, just as the storm of human emotion that had threatened to destroy two families had finally found its resolution in understanding rather than continued conflict.